Elaine Power is a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies and the current head of the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. She's also the co-founder of the Kingston Action Group for a Basic Income Guarantee. In this episode, she discusses the challenge of incorporating feminist perspectives into the relatively new field of food studies, and the goal of making the field inherently feminist by working to appreciate the central importance of power differentials in determining who has the privilege of indulging in food and who suffers the indignity of food insecurity. If capitalism creates, as she says, the conditions for this most intimate experience of eating food to be debasing, then clearly we need legal reforms like a guaranteed basic income to shield people put in an impossible economic position from the harm produced by an industrialized and unequal food system. She also expresses a measured hope that the COVID-19 pandemic is creating the conditions for more empathy to emerge in political discourse, which, she points out, is the only way toward a more humanitarian future. I wanted to start with the article you wrote, which I think is co-written, called "Filling Our Plate: A Spotlight on Feminist Food Studies," because this methodology is what particularly interests me. You write in that article, doing food scholarship has often meant further marginalizing oneself from academic and or feminist communities that did not value food as an object of research or theorization. And you also note that the uptake of feminist perspectives in addressing the scholarship concerns and conversations taking place within Canadian food studies has been limited. Why do you think that this is maybe a particular problem in Canadian food studies? Do you see it shifting, and what would it take for a shift in food studies to properly incorporate feminism?
So, when food studies is a relatively new field of academic inquiry, I think you could probably date it to the mid 90s. And when, the 1970s, the second wave feminists really, many of them tried really hard to get away from the home and the kitchen and anything domestic. And so when some of the early I think about Arlene Avakian, who wrote a book, I think in the early '90s, through the kitchen window, and she contacted feminists to ask them if they would contribute stories about food, and many of them were quite rude to her in response because they were working really hard to get away from the kitchen. And so that's really contributed to the marginalization of food. I mean, food, it seems so perverse. I guess it's not uncommon that capitalism kind of takes the most, intimate and most important aspects of our lives and debases and devalues them. But it just sounds so banal to say, we can't live without food, and food is nutrients, but it's also symbolic, and all of the rest. But it's also very invisible, and the work that people do to put food on the table, whether it's the migrant farm workers or the grocery store clerks or the people in the household, which usually women, who put food on the table, it's invisible, and it's devalued, and it's marginalized. So, I think feminists, particularly from the last century, second wave feminists, who didn't want to be associated with that. And so, we also have in food studies a much stronger focus, I would say, on the production aspect of food, the food system, agriculture, and so on. And that tends to be dominated by men who don't always pay attention some of whom are feminists and many of whom are not. So they don't necessarily pay attention to the intersections of gender and race and class and so on. And so I think that's what we envision for a feminist food studies. We hope that at some point that's, food studies will be inherently feminist by paying attention to those power differentials rather than needing an extra adjective at the front.
Of course, yeah, and speaks to, I think, this next question I was going to ask about how we move toward a maybe more utopian vision by thinking about food. By not just thinking about food as something that we eat, but thinking about food as something that we cultivate and distribute and so on. As you say, there's so much work required, so much labor, and so a feminist perspective, but perhaps also a Marxist feminist perspective, allows you to bring all of these issues together: issues of inequality, disenfranchisement, and labor. In the article, the visible and invisible occupations of food provisioning in low income families that you co-wrote with two other scholars, you address so many of these kinds of issues. It really stood out to me as a remarkably dense piece of research in all the best ways. You say, for example, just statistically, over the past 2 decades, 10 to 20% of Canadians have consistently fallen below federally established low income cutoff. You say, not surprisingly, over 12% of Canadian households experience food insecurity, lacking the resources to provide the food they need, with 34% of lone parents facing food insecurity. I wanted to ask about your recent appearance on another podcast, In the Loop, with Mark Gerritsen, where you talk about basic income and how you, and this is interesting to me, how you don't choose to support universal basic income because the downside, as you put it, is the upfront cost of implementing it, and the fact that the wealthy have many ways of avoiding paying taxes. What you argue for, and this is where I want to kind of take it, is for a more practical model of a potentially more utopian, or at least very more fair society, where there is a more strategic distribution of basic income. And you note, for example, that we shouldn't see the idea of a basic income as radical. Why was it important to emphasize that point, to correct, as it were, the tendency to represent this idea, especially during a pandemic, as radical? Is it just about sort of tactics, rhetorical tactics, but also political tactics to kind of get this pushed forward?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I think it's all of those. I think there is a political tactic. I don't actually, I mean, I think basic income has the potential to be radical. On the other hand, way back in 1949, 1948, Canada signed the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that said that everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living. And I think to our ears that are so accustomed, to 40 years of government cutbacks and government being a bad thing and taxation being a bad thing, that there's a way in which that does sound kind of radical. Everyone is, entitled to the right to a basic standard of living, but it's not. I mean, really, like you're like, what purpose? What purpose are our lives if not to look after each other? I mean, I think this endless pursuit of profit and the veneration of people who make a lot of money is, again, it's a perversion. It's like, what does that accomplish? It's destroying the planet, and we're destroying ourselves in the process. So there's a way in which I think, if we can assure as a society, just assure the kind of basic necessities of life, nothing extravagant, like 20 or $22,000 a year is not going to give you an extravagant life. It will allow you to have some sense of, dignity and belonging in our society. You can, if you're not living in Toronto or Vancouver, you can put a roof over your head and food on the table. And then consider what you want to do with your life and who you want to be, and the best person that you can be, without the kind of mad, desperate sense that if you don't get a job, any job, just something to put food on the table, then you're gonna you might die. I mean, really, when it comes right down to it, or you'll land on social assistance, which is just barely staying alive with the amount of money that we allow. So I see basic income as what we owe each other, much as Medicare. We don't all use Medicare all the time. It's there when we need it. If we had a basic income program like Medicare that allowed people to access the program when they need it, we could erase a lot of the insecurity, the anxiety and the insecurity. And that, I think, is where the potential for basic income to be radical comes in. Because if, I mean, maybe I am idealistic and naive, but I think it will allow people to kind of step back and think about, as I say, who they want to be and the kind of world they want to live in. And I mean, guess there'll always be people who are, as my dad would say, chasing the almighty dollar. But, for lots of other people, they're would be satisfied with a simpler kind of life.
Hmm. I think you have a real skill for making these ideas sort of relatable and bridgeable. There's a way in which, attacking the roots of a capitalist system that punishes the poor can sometimes alienate particular listeners. But on that podcast, you speak with Mark Gerritsen about how these ideas are really 19th century moral values, assumptions that tell us that without the motivation of trying to survive, people will just stop working. But you have as I said, kind of a skillful way of addressing these kind of core capitalist beliefs and values. But you spoke to that question of sort of like the pursuit of the almighty dollar or hoarding wealth. I wanted to maybe ask about the notion of a guaranteed like maximum income or a tax on the wealthy, right? Um, are these ideas at this point too radical to be bridgeable, or do you sense that Jeff Bezos being on track to have $1 trillion by whatever the projection is starting to actually create a sense that that is a dystopian future? I mean, at some point, do you expect it might be possible to be less strategic and more utopian in advocating for a more humanitarian, equal food system?
Well, yes is the short answer. Thank you for your compliments. I don't know. I think maybe it was years of teaching a first year course on the social determinants of health that has helped me put, complex ideas into language that's accessible. I don't know, but um, I think, that podcast that you reference has really become quite popular, and people have told me that it's because it is accessible. So I think, I'm a little I'm very suspicious of polls because, of course, the answers depend on how the questions are framed. But I did see a poll recently that suggested that most Canadians are in favor of a wealth tax to help pay for social programs. I think this is one of the silver linings of COVID. As devastating as it has been, there have been silver linings, and one of them is to again give us an opportunity to stop and think about what's important. And remarkably, we decided, or the government decided, are supposed to be our representatives, that human life was more important than the economy. And that's a bit remarkable when you think about the last 40 years and the ways in which human life has been devalued in favor of the pursuit of profit. Again, I think this is we deserve better politicians who would actually provide more leadership on engaging some of these questions and kind of raising their gaze away from the bottom line and taxes, and thinking again about what kind of country do we want, what kind of society do we want. The Jeff Bezos of the world and the millionaires in Canada who make that money profiting on other people's labor. I think there's a we can see really clearly that these inequalities are reinforcing themselves and getting larger and larger without government intervention. They'll just continue to grow. So this is a place where government could provide leadership, and I hope if we push enough that tax reform, more progressive. Our tax system has gotten progressively less progressive. Over the years, it favors the wealthy, and it favors corporations over individual Canadians. And I hope that the next stage in our recovery from COVID, although we're still in the thick of it, is a really robust and sophisticated adult conversation about tax reform that enables us to look after each other, as I think we should.
Hmm. I like that you speak to the kind of ambivalent, as it were, kind of importance of polling and data. It's helpful. For example, the fact that the global protests against police brutality are obviously effective, if for no other reason than you can see public opinion is now exponentially increasing in favor of Black Lives Matter in just the last couple of weeks. So obviously, protests work, and the data kind of bears that out. This is something that you've talked about in relationship to food in general, kind of in a different context, in a policy context. You note, for example, in an article that for the first time, Ontario has opted out of measuring food insecurity on the 2015 Canadian Community Health Survey cycle, which leaves, as you say, a gaping hole in public health researchers' ability to assess the impact of public policies. I wanted to ask about the importance of data, of having current sociological data in determining who is at risk and being able to kind of see the landscape. How do we understand the importance of data for providing advocates, activists, and researchers a sense of how to act? I mean, and I guess also the question I would ask is why opt out? I mean, is it just about the neoliberal ideology of a free market fundamentalism at work? Do we just not want to acknowledge the importance of poverty as a determinant of health?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, data, real evidence, that's well collected, of course, is critical. It's so important for a government and for advocates, as you say. But if a government is truly interested in making change and assessing how their policies are affecting people and on the ground, then of course they need data. We live in this bizarre world where, particularly on the right, there's data doesn't count for anything because it's really just about ideology. There's a little bit less of that, I would say, certainly on the left or in the center. But we don't know why that decision was made in Ontario. That was under Kathleen Wynne, under the Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne. That decision was made to not collect the data about household food insecurity. So the Canadian Community Health Survey, or CCHS, is an ongoing survey that's run by Stats Canada, and it's in 2-year cycles. And so in some years, the federal government makes it mandatory that all provinces ask about food insecurity. And in other years, provinces are allowed to opt out. So for the first time ever, Ontario opted out in the 2015-2016 cycle. And Ontario constitutes almost 40% of the Canadian population. So that blows a huge hole, not just in understanding what's happening in Ontario, but also across the country in terms of the robustness of the data. So, a cynical view of that decision is that the Ontario government knew that the results would be coming out around the time of the provincial election. And perhaps they were confident that it was going to show, progress in meeting their poverty reduction targets. A less cynical view is that the bureaucracy, the civil servants, has been so decimated that they just didn't understand the importance of it. So it doesn't, however the decision was made, whether it was deliberate and trying to cover something up or whether it was ineptitude, it's not very flattering either way. Um, so, but data, yeah, absolutely, we need data. And right now, as I understand it, at least the Canadian Community Health Survey has been suspended at this time of COVID, which again is devastating in terms of thinking about the impacts of this particular moment on the health of Canadians and Canadian communities.
And one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you is because the kind of data that you collect and that you analyze, qualitative data, highly detailed data, is particularly, I think, capable of communicating the particular struggle that especially people on the margins have. In the article that I mentioned, the visible and invisible occupations of food provisioning, you say, you talk about data. You say, while evidence is amassing regarding the prevalence of food insecurity and related health consequences, we have that data. You say, few analyses explore firsthand experiences of food insecurity. And this is where I guess qualitative investigation comes in. You talk in that article about how, in particular, low income mothers describe their lives as a constant struggle. In another article, Cultural and Symbolic Capital with and Without Economic Constraint, you compare low income and high income Canadian families and talk about the level of stress that is associated with shopping on a low income. Right? One respondent says, I think about food constantly every single day. You describe this as a relentless everyday stress. Why is it important that we see the stress involved in the everyday work of getting and preparing food? Are these things, to your mind, typically invisibilized? I mean, the culture around food, when we look to popular representations, don't tend to give us a sense of these aspects of the experience, the stress and the work of it.
Well, I think just as a matter of basic human compassion that we we ought to care about the incredible stress and the terrible decisions that parents in particular, mothers in particular, have to face about, whether they're going to eat themselves or, get a birthday present for their kid. The kind of the indignities that low income families face every day is I just think it's devastating, and to me it's symbolic of a society that just doesn't care about human beings anymore. um, and so yes, that work is invisible. It's also, I mean, from a more I don't know, instrumental perspective, if you want to think about it that way, it has profound effects on healthcare expenses. When you live in that kind of constant stress, it has a terribly damaging effect on health. And we know from at a microscopic level, it literally affects our DNA and how long we live. There's evidence from DNA studies that as the DNA replicates, the what's called the telomeres actually shorten when you're living in chronic stress, whether that's stress of poverty or maybe the stress of having a child with a disability, profound disability. And if you have both of those together, your lifespan is likely to be shortened. Um, Let alone on the stress, but also the poor nutrition, because which also exacerbates the effects of the stress, because you don't have actually the proper nutrition, the antioxidants that you need, that would help your physiologically help your body to cope with the stress. So if there's actually really good data, Val Tarasuk at the University of Toronto, who is kind of the guru of certainly statistical scholarly studies research on this problem, she's has a very elegant piece of work that shows that as the household food insecurity increases, so as people get are more poor and have less access to food, that healthcare costs go up dramatically. So, from an instrumental point of view, if I were in a government position, if I were the health minister, I'd be looking at that and saying, "Oh my, this is poverty has a big impact on healthcare costs. If we actually address the poverty, healthcare costs would go down. Probably at least 20% of our healthcare costs are related directly to poverty. That's the Canadian Medical Association has estimated that. Um, I mean, that in and of itself is reason to address this. But, I think to me, my mind, the more important issue is actually people's ability to live in dignity and to feel like they belong in our society.
And so much of your work is about sort of trying to unpack the entrenched assumptions that reproduce these kinds of class divisions. That have everything to do with economics, but also have these kind of larger, or rather kind of deeper origins. And I could speak to my own personal experience of growing up in like a working class household where there was a level of suspicion toward organic foods, premium items, that kind of stuff, and a tendency toward convenience due to a large family size. You talk in one article about the embarrassment of having to put items back or count change at the register. That's something I've experienced, and it's painful. I think encouraging empathy for this situation is so crucial. And this is what your work tends to do, is kind of bring this data to life. You gesture, for example, to alternative discourses that may be employed to resist stigma and discourses that challenge dominant constructions of people living in poverty. What would you say these are? I mean, you've kind of just addressed some of them, but yeah, where can we look for a corrective to the kind of neoliberal ethos of the failed consumer?
Well, I think, again, that this is maybe a part of the silver lining of COVID. All of a sudden, you have literally millions of people who've lost their job for no fault of their own, who suddenly have that experience of maybe staying awake all night, wondering, where the next meal is going to come from or how they're going to juggle all the bills, maybe having to go to a food bank. But I guess. Um, Part of the issue is again the hierarchy and the value that we place on consumption and excess, the kind of decadence that we see, that's glorified. So, if we imagine, I think about, the West Coast indigenous peoples who, their sign of status was how much you could give away to other people, right? It wasn't about accumulating. It was about, if you're high status, you give everything away. If we had a society that valued what people like people who contribute, who actually contribute all that they could rather than accumulating more and more, that would turn that upside down, I think. If we had an ethos of, can we make the world, can we can we contribute more than we've been given? Can we add back rather than taking and always taking? Um, so my one of the again perverse effects, I think, of this veneration of wealth is that if you're from a working class family and you watched your parents, or you are busting yourself to hustle and put to get that food on the table, then it's actually easy to look to people on social assistance or on EI who are unemployed and say, you're lazy because you're so close to it, that and it's so stigmatized that you want to distance yourself from the quote unquote lazy bums. Um, so I worry about that because it's and I understand that, especially if you're one step above the lowest rung, then you want to distance yourself from that stigmatized group. But I see that as an effect of the larger society, rather than blaming working class folks for saying, I'm not going to support those lazy bums with a basic income.
I think so, yeah. And, I think we could connect it to some of the kinds of stereotyping and projection that's directed at, Indigenous communities. In one of your articles titled Aboriginal Isn't Just About What Was Before, It's What's Happening Now, you talk about perspectives on Indigenous peoples and how the notion that, the diets of Indigenous people primarily are traditional is just false. And having a deeper understanding of this, not just projecting, is part of, as you say, the difficult work of reconciliation, of coming to know each other and living in a mutually respectful relationship. So not just necessarily romanticizing, deifying, but actually trying to know in deeper ways what's happening is part of the key thing here. And to kind of maybe get back to that question of decadence, you note in cultural and symbolic capital that the elitism of ethical eating is actually declining as a source of cultural capital, which is a curious fact, something that maybe people don't think is the case. But instead, you say when cultural knowledge, forms, and practices like healthy eating and ethical eating become widespread, even among low-income shoppers, they lose their symbolic capital and don't garner the same level of distinction. And instead, now you have this troubling resurgence, maybe, of a certain kind of decadence, right? A means of marking distinction through food quality and authenticity, and maybe even certain kinds of convenience, but like a curated, cultivated kind of convenience. I wanted to note also the emergence of skip the dishes, Uber Eats, as potential markers of status. Have you thought through the sudden prominence of these services, or maybe even, like for me, interrogated that brand name, Skip the Dishes? A banner that kind of signifies a complete embrace of convenience and abandonment of prior forms of cultural capital that was sort of associated with preparing food. Um, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's one of the features of our contemporary world, I think, is polarization. And on the one hand, we have the skip the dishes phenomena, and on the other hand, in COVID time, we have the veneration of sourdough. Everyone at home making sourdough bread and kind of posting photos on social media of their various creations, and also the rush to plant, to garden again, to put food in, which everyone's kind of thinking they're going to be hanging around home. So on the one hand, we have people engaging more, and I have no evidence for this, but I'm sure there's a class component of that as well, and not just in terms of socioeconomic, but probably cultural capital as well. People who have education, who also have the income to be able now at home cultivating their sourdough starter and their tomato plants. And then on the other hand, again, this is incredible polarization, and the people who are, the all of a sudden we have these people like the grocery store cashiers who are poorly paid and have no benefits and don't have full-time jobs, but suddenly they're our heroes. I mean, I would love to send skip the dishes to some of those folks who are working long, hard hours at the grocery store. Um, but you're right. I mean, it is so. I don't really know if I have anything more coherent to say about it, except that it seems like another sign of this polarization, and yeah, that seems to be one of the features of our society. The kind of there's nothing in between, it seems.
Hmm. And definitely, I think we're seeing further. Like you've noted some of the silver linings with the coronavirus pandemic, but I think we're also, of course, seeing further stratification. And you've kind of just pointed to some of the sources of that. Given how much your research reveals the length, for example, that higher income people will go to actually avoid spaces of consumption that they perceive as less clean, for example, than others. Do you think that the fear not only of contagion, but in a sense of lower income people is determining buying habits? And what does this say about the polarization, the level of inequality in contemporary society?
Our food system, I mean, that's not my area of expertise, but again, the virus has shown us on so many levels the way we've created a food system that is industrialized and dominated by a very few, very large multinational corporations. It's again seems like another sign of the failure of capitalism and the ways it is leading us to the edge of self-destruction environmentally, and also just in the way it uses up people's lives. I was in a local chain grocery store in Loblaws, just as the pandemic was, as the measures to shut things down were starting, like mid March, and I managed to find some product that claimed to, disinfect, but also keep, to stay on the surface for 24 hours. Heaven knows what's in it. But the cashier was examined, this Loblaws cashier was examining it very closely. And she asked where I found it. The shipment must have just come in, because there were a number of items on the shelf. And it turns out here she is. She's a woman, probably maybe in her mid 50s, looking at this can of disinfectant, and she's on chemotherapy in the midst of a pandemic. And it just stayed with me, the way in which people are forced against their own best interests to work at these jobs because they have no other option. Who in their if you had any other option, who would be working at a grocery store? This was before the plastic shields went up, but even with those, if you were immunocompromised from chemotherapy, it just blows my mind. And it's horrible.
Yeah, and I think this is again what I find so valuable about your work. It's trying to make visible some of these generally invisibilized things, and the point that you make in the article that I mentioned a few times, that uses this language of the visible and invisible. You talk about how food provisioning is so commonplace, so mundane, that it is easily taken for granted. It is, as it were, the quintessential consumable, right? And that we actually consume it. And so I guess the question becomes, does thinking more deeply about food get us somewhere, more critical, more mobilized? I mean, you talk, for example, in your Cultural and Symbolic Capital article about how even things like a shopping from a grocery list are not universal across all classes. These like everyday habits. What does focusing on these often automatic habits, on the specific meaning attached to eating well, doing a good job of feeding oneself and one's family, give us in terms of a critical methodology? Is there a way in which we tend to forget that eating provides a lot more than just sustenance? It provides a sense of solace and meaning, and involves all of these invisibilized forms of labor.
I think about the people who take completely for granted the food that appears on the table. It's often in a heterosexual couple, it's often the man, not always. In fact, was a really interesting study quite a few years ago now about domestic labor in same-sex households that replicated what the research from heterosexual households, that there's one person who takes primary responsibility for the food work and the food, the provisioning and all the invisible labor, and then the other person just doesn't have a clue. Just takes it for granted. And even in same sex, so it's not clearly, I wonder if how many households where there is a real true division of labor. And maybe that's not important, I don't know. But I also wonder if, because people have been at home for the last 13, 14 weeks, if some of that labor has become visible. Certainly the labor of childcare and the labor of food provisioning. We have to think a lot more about our grocery shopping, and thinking ahead about putting food on the table. It's not as easy as it used to be to just dash out to pick up a few things at the grocery store. Although, as you mentioned, there is the skip the dishes. um, but I think some of that labor maybe has become more visible in this moment. And also the kind of as you say, the comfort aspect of food. People, I think, are in these times of when everyone is feeling, some level of stress more, or distress, some more than others. But I think many of us have turned to comfort foods to soothe some of that anxiety. I think, I'm sure we were talking at the beginning about obesity. I think, that the anti-obesity public health folks are probably going a bit berserk with anticipating a massive jump in BMIs in the country. But, I do wonder if at this moment, some of that invisible labor has become more visible than it used to be.
Hmm. I have, personally a lot of thoughts on the politics of obesity, but, I want to maybe just gesture to one piece of the article, the chapter that you wrote for Neoliberal Governance and Health on childhood obesity, where you talk about whole foods and how it's really the kind of like perfect fix for virtuous consumption, the decadence and the kind of distinction that comes from shopping in this particular place. You write in that article about how the duty of a good, virtuous, I'm quoting you, neoliberal consumer citizen is to know how to make proper, responsible choices in the marketplace and to exercise restraint and responsibility in that freedom of choice, a disciplined, responsibilized freedom that is nonetheless associated with fun and pleasure. What I like is that in this piece, rather than attributing it to just an exploitative corporate conspiracy to kind of harness our desire to purchase pleasurable food that also distinguishes us, your work focuses on the prior ideological shifts that potentiated things like Whole Foods, and tries to articulate a more kind of complex form of resistance, I think, that makes people self-aware about the structure that they're ensnared in, basically. And my last question, because you've given me quite a bit of your time, has to do with the consumption of animals, actually, and the work that you did alongside Samantha King, whose work I think is incredible on the politics of breast cancer awareness and activism. R. Scott Carey, Victoria Niva, so many people. Like this is a work that a book that I think everyone should look at called Messy Eating: Conversations on Animals as Food. Part of the goal of that book is to move beyond the somewhat simplistic tactic of shaming meat eaters, encouraging this kind of digestive dissonance, as John Mualem calls it, the repulsion felt toward the act of eating animals, which you sort of say collaboratively is a limited position from which to start articulating a politics of ethical eating. There's this powerful idea that speaks to the importance of trying to see things structurally, where you talk about how it's a limited tactic to just go vegan when you exist in an advanced factory farming system that is industrialized. So, like, while Apricot Lane Farms gets lionized in the documentary The Biggest Little Farm, most of us are still left ensnared by the system. Um, can you speak to what the kind of key insight was that you took away from collaborating on this incredibly interdisciplinary text? I mean, yeah, how did you what did you learn from studying the convergence of this kind of critical animal studies literature and the kind of politics of consuming animals themselves?
To me, it's all summed up in the title, "Messy Eating." It's so complicated, and uh, it I played a small role in that book, but if I remember correctly, the title that was actually my idea, and it to me it encapsulates this whole the message. If you stop to think about the ethics of eating and how to eat ethically, well, I don't know that there actually is such a thing. The only the only food that I can eat with a completely clear conscience is the food that I grow in my backyard, which is a fairly limited amount of my annual intake. But this idea, like, there is no innocent position. And so I think, again, we have this, we seem to want, and I understand it, we want clarity, we want black and white, we want to have like a solid moral position, especially if you start to think about it. But there is none. We really have to learn, I think, as to be more comfortable with the messiness and the grayness. And um, we seem to have this desire to fit ourselves into a category and then moralize about everybody else, and that's whether it's moralizing about poor people or moralizing about people who eat animals or people who eat so-called junk food. It makes us feel better about ourselves to put other people down. And again, that seems to be a function of the kind of hierarchical society that we live in. And if I hope that this is one of the things we can start to tackle collectively, to realize that, we're all just doing our best, and there is no us and them.
Thanks so much, Elaine. I know you have other things to get to. I really appreciate you making the time.
Oh, this has been such a pleasure, and I really feel quite honored that you spent so much time finding and reading some of the things that I've written.